Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. We're so happy you're joining the Association of Black Psychologists creating Zola Mondays. I am Dr. Linda James Myers, moderator for today's program, and we have an extremely special guest with us today. I'm going to give him an honorary doctorate, Dr. Gregory Cooke, who's going to share with us about his wonderful work. And I will let the rest of our panelists introduce themselves.
Well, just quickly, I'm Harvey Linder. I'm a clinical psychologist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'll leave it at that for now so we can get to our guest.
And I'm Dr. Jonathan Lassiter. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in New York City and a professor in South Jersey.
Hey y'all, I'm Dr. Robina Nwanga. I'm from Maryland and I'm based in Houston right now. And I was trained as a counseling psychologist, but I work more in the industrial organizational psychology space now.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, my name is my name is Dr. Jonisha Hickson. I am the DC Vice Chair of the DC chapter, so based in Washington, DC. I know we're a little pressed for time, so I'll keep it at that.
Okay. Well, I just have to throw this in. Dr. Robina and Dr. Jonisha just came back from Kenya. Yay. So at some point we'll have to discuss that.
It's on my bucket list.
Yes, getting to our special guest today, we have Mr. Gregory Cooke, who has done something very phenomenal. I don't know anybody else who's done this, but he's also produced two very important documentaries. One particularly relevant to the National Black Women's Labor Day. Whoop, whoop. And so can you tell us a little bit about how this came about, Gregory?
Sure. National Black Women's Labor Day, my organization, Basil and Becky Educational Foundation. Basil was my late uncle. Becky was my mother. They were siblings. And so they helped me at the beginning of this journey. But National Black Women's Labor Day, my organization created as it's official through the Library of Congress. Maybe 500 years from now, you'll get a day off from work and get paid for it. But it's on April 5th of this year. And the reason I created it was to acknowledge Black women's labor in this country. Most of our time here, most of us Black men, women, our labor was of being enslaved people, and so I wanted to do something to acknowledge the history of Black women in labor. And it's really an offshoot of my documentary, Invisible Warriors, African American Women in World War II, which is about the 600,000 Black women, Black Rosie the Riveters, who went to work in shipyards, government offices, factories, etc. during World War II. My mother was one of those women. And real fast, this is a picture of my mother. This is Ethel Rebecca Becky Jones Cooke. And when I was a little boy, 3-4 years old, she told me a story about how she rode on her suitcase from Norfolk, Virginia to Washington, D.C. to get her very first job as a clerk typist in the U.S. Patent Office. So real fast, that's my mom. And so that was part of my thinking as to why I started this date. And I picked April 5th. Years ago, people look, God, Shay, her name is Shay Battle. She did started made April Black Women's History, International Black Women's History Month, and she got the city of Atlanta to issue proclamations, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, wow, that's cool, coming right after Women's Heritage Month in March. And I think we needed something to specifically specifically honor and recognize Black women. And so that's what drove me to do that. And as I said, there were 600,000 Black women who did that work, who went to work during World War II. And in my opinion, as a group, they were the most, there's still some alive, but most of them have transitioned. But they are, in my opinion, the most significant group of African-American women post-enslavement because of their size and because of the barriers they broke and in the context and time in which they came onto the forefront. And these women played a major role post-war, establishing the Black, helping to solidify and establish the Black middle class. And they were also the backbone, and that same generation was the backbone of what we now call the civil rights movement. So it's really about honoring. And then I picked April 5th because one of the women, the stars of my documentary, Mrs. Ruth Wilson, here in Philadelphia, where I am, Friday is her 102nd birthday.
Oh,
And during World War II, she helped build an aircraft carrier, the USS Valley Forge at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So it all kind of lined up, and that's what the holiday is about. And we're intent upon making this a movement, so that it's something that outlives me and everybody else, and to get it within the consciousness of Black people and particularly Black women, because I think Black women are bad. No doubt. I think Black women are bad. So that's
we so very much agree with you.
yeah.
Can you tell us? I've seen Invisible Warriors. It's a wonderful documentary. How can people see it? Where would they be able to see it?
Okay, well, this Friday from 8 to 10 p.m., we're having a global screening. It's also a fundraiser, so it's minimal $15 per ticket. We're having a global screening this Friday, April 5th, National Black Women's Labor Day. The program will be roughly from about 8 to 10 p.m. It'll be introduced by Dr. Vedette Coleman Robinson, who is the executive director of the African American the National Association. Sorry, I'm butchering the name. The African American Museum Association. She's the executive director, of roughly 100 different, Black museums across the country. And so she's going to be doing the introduction. And so people can see it. They can go to bbeef.org for registration. They can go to invisiblewarriorsfilm.com, and they can also follow us on Instagram and get information there at Basil and Becky Ed. And what I would like you all to do is circulate this to your networks. You have the opportunity to sit in on something special. We're also having a panel discussion. There's going to be a discussion about the accomplishments and challenges that African American women really still face in the workplace. And what I find troubling, is some of the issues that Black women in the workplace, higher ed, and the corporate world, they're dealing with the same problems that these women dealt with 80 years ago in factories. But in both cases, Black women during World War II and Black women today are still going into new spaces. And so you're getting some of the same issues coming up. And so we're going to have a panel discussion about that as well.
Excellent. We know you have to run shortly. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure, I do.
I won't ask it. Anybody have a question they want to share?
I'm curious about whether in this process, because of course, like it being recognized by the Library of Congress, that's still part of this system that continues to oppress us. What type of, what was that conversation or process like? Was there any pushback? How long did it take? I'm curious of what you can share.
First of all, I had no contact with anybody human, right? This is all about paying money and getting it designated at that. This is a National Avocado Day. This is a national day for, you name it, it's out there, right? So there was no pushback. I had to, write up a couple of paragraphs about what it's about, why I'm doing it, etc. And my organization paid the fee to make this happen. And that was about it. And I think for a lot of people.
Can you talk about how long it took?
It took about
to get the approval?
About 72 hours.
Oh, that's not bad.
Which is unusual for the government, right? Yeah, it took about 72 hours.
Wow.
Wow.
I've never known the government to do anything really to
Right.
help.
The Library of Congress is also working on doing a screening in Washington. We were supposed to screen in 2020, but it went away because of COVID. And one final thing I'd like to say, if this is the final thing, on April 10th, in Washington, the U.S. Congress is awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the World War II Rosie the Riveters. There were approximately 8 million American women of all ethnic and racial stripes who went to work during the war just because of the war. And so there's a woman named May Cryer who lives outside of Philly. She helped make, she worked at Boeing during World War II. She worked Congress for 35 years to get this. And it's my belief that it's primarily because of my documentary and the work we've been doing that Black women are even in this discussion. So we will be at the ceremony. There are going to be 4 Black Rosies there and their families. The baby of the group is 99. Okay. So we will be represented. And I really believe it's because of this documentary and the other work we've done that we are in this space now.
Well, I've seen excerpts from the documentary, and I'm looking forward to seeing the entire thing. But I wonder if you could touch on just a little bit about what happened to the lives of these women after the war.
Good question. For most of these women, right after the war, they went back to domestic service, right? Because prior to the war, according to the 1940 census, more than 80% of all Black women were either domestics or sharecroppers. So that's what most Black women had to look forward to. So immediately after the war, most of these women went back to domestic service. But that was short-lived because things were changing in America. Black men predominantly came home from the war and said, we're not going to tolerate sitting in the back of the bus anymore. We're not going to tolerate not being able to vote. And so it was Black soldiers who were in the war, who many of them spearheaded the civil rights movement. So if we look at these women over the course of their lifetimes, because remember, they were children during the Great Depression, and then they did this during World War II. If we look at their lives over the course of their lifetimes, I would say relative to where they were born and what prospects that they had, I think they all had very successful lives. I'll point to one of them, Mrs. Willie Mae Govan. In my own opinion, she had the most difficult life. She grew up in Alabama. And so she had to drop out of school in 10th grade. Her mother was transitioning and she took care of that. And then the war comes and she went to work for E.I. DuPont in Childersburg, Alabama. That was very challenging to her because she's the only woman I've ever talked to who acknowledged sexual harassment and all that. But after the war, she got her high school diploma when she was 60 years old. After she got her high school diploma, she became an ordained minister. After she became an ordained minister, she bought a plot of land, and after she bought a plot of land, she built a chapel on it. I think her story is very emblematic of what happened as a group to these women and what they did and the impact that they had on this society. So that's just one example, but phenomenal women.
Well, you've done a phenomenal job, Dr. Cooke. I mean, just sharing with us these women's stories and their experiences and bringing attention to Black women in the labor force and what they've done for humanity and definitely their families in this society. So great historian, great journalist. And before you go, what is the name of your second documentary?
Well, actually, Invisible Warriors, African-American women in World War II is the second one. The first documentary is called Chocolate Soldiers from the USA. And it's about the 140,000, primarily men, who were in Great Britain, well, exclusively men who were in Great Britain prior to D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the relationship that they developed with white British civilians and soldiers, as a matter of fact. Which was totally unexpected because the U.S. Army imported Jim Crow to Great Britain during the war. And so their experience, again, opened their eyes to possibilities because for the first time, Black Americans were around white people who treated them as human beings, who treated them as equals, and who treated them as Americans. And so they had that experience. And when they came home from the war, they were obviously changed by it.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to have you back so we can get deeper into these conversations and discussions of these two documentaries, but we don't want to make you late for the Library of Congress, so we'll let you go. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. And what I'm going to do before I go, I'm going to type in the chat contact information.
Oh, wonderful. Appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you.
And hopefully people will be seeing you on April the 5th.
Yes.
So while he's typing in the information for the people so they can access him as well as his work, I want us to continue our conversation about our theme for today, which is recognizing the return of the divine Black feminine at work. Because I think we think of things or someone being at work, a job, but the divine Black feminine has been at work not on a job per se, but certainly influencing justice and equity and all the things good since the beginning of recorded history. Thanks, Dr. Cooke. So,
since well before the beginning of recorded history, since
yes,
the beginning of time.
Well, we can only document recorded history, but certainly since the beginning of time, because we have to really begin to reframe. You're reminding me, we have to reframe what we understand to be the case about the beginning of time. So we can take this conversation in so many directions, but I was very pleased and very impressed with the work done by Gregory Cooke. He's been, sounds like a one-man army making this happen. And certainly one of the things that needs to happen as we think about the return of the divine Black feminine at work is we will see greater recognition of that energy. And we're seeing through his work and through the activities of so many Black women across this country and the world, how the divine feminine is literally at work and returning.
Could you, Dr. Myers, could you sort of give us your understanding of the divine feminine?
Oh, goodness. I'm so happy you asked. No,
just so I know where we are, to how to locate myself in the discussion.
Sure. And I appreciate the question because I'm sure everybody, you're not the only one who had, what is she talking about? So one of the things we know from the historical records from Nubia, Kemet, classical African civilizations, in their historical records, they talk about the creative life force coming with the energy of Ma'at. We think of Ma'at as truth, justice, righteousness, those wonderful moral values, but they envision Ma'at as that divine energy that comes with creation. Divine in this context means supremely good. So everything that exists with an aspect of Ma'at or that divine energy. So when we talk about the divine feminine, in part, we're referring to that divine energy that came with creation. We're also referring to the fact that historically, that feminine energy has been taken out of history. So let's see, Will Coleman, who's Dr. Will Coleman, who has done research on interpretation of biblical scripture, going back to the Hebrew. He talks about the fact that the first people to talk about the resurrection were women. He talks about by the time that gets translated into Greek, it's both masculine and feminine. And by the time it gets to English, it is now male. So there's been a masking of an energy that has been with us since the beginning of time that is feminine energy. I will say this, though, and it's very important that people understand, women aren't the only ones that have feminine energy. All human beings have it. women are the ones who embody it in this time and space, in this life, and oftentimes play a special role. Unlike the Euro-Western cultural mindset that negates women and sees them inferior as objects, much like they see Black people, the African cultural traditions always elevated women, and for the most part, seen them as the value they are to society, their communities, and humanity. So when I speak of the divine Black feminine, that's what I'm talking about. But Dr. Jonisha Hickson is also presented at TheABPsi about the divine Black feminine. So is there anything you'd like to add, Dr. Jonisha?
Yeah, I really love your attention to the, I guess, diurnal thinking or logic that's applied to this concept, wherein you're talking about how the divine feminine is like complementary to the divine masculine, if you will, but also embodies that as well. And so when Dr. Bethea and I were presenting at the conference on this concept and connecting it to the women in the Black Panther Party, it really provided a great framework for how these women were showing up, especially at a time where their comrades, their male counterparts, were being, taken away to jail or pumped with drugs so that they couldn't lead the party. And that's where you start to see these different programs coming out of the Black Panther Party when the women were kind of at the fore, like the lunch program or the sickle cell research coming out of the party. And so I really just love the idea and the attention to the fact that while feminine is in the word in the concept that we're talking about, it is more so about this balance and just trying to bring forth attention to everybody, whether they identify as male or female, transgender, whomever, two-spirit, has like this capacity that can be described by the divine feminine to care for people around them, to pay attention to the interconnection to people around them, to be strong, but also soft at the same time. And I'm still like, it's been a couple years since that presentation, but I'm still definitely trying to figure out what exactly the divine feminine, the Black divine feminine looks like for me and how I tap into that so I can show up in ways that are kind of complementary to one another, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you show up every day. Trust me, you show up every day, you and Robina, manifesting that, because it simply means we're standing up for truth, justice, and righteousness. So if you're standing up for truth, justice, and righteousness, you are representing that divine Black feminine and are the embodiment of it. And the mindset of classical African civilization clearly shows us it's never either or. It's always both and. And you can't have one without the other. They're both necessary to the greater good of the whole.
Whenever we get into a conversation like this, I'm reminded of the fact of how we are so accustomed to thinking in dichotomies that we forget, that, or maybe we were never aware that, in the beginning, if you go back all the way back through classical African civilization and history and the mythos, the origin of the divine feminine was not gendered. It was, Atum was, both, what we would consider both male and female, but it's hard for us to think of it that way because we're so accustomed to thinking of the dichotomy that we automatically divide it, to think of a being that incorporated both, the
So
masculine and feminine spectrum.
Atum incorporated everything, since that's a creative life source. So it's the totality for sure. And it'll be so good when we begin to expand our bandwidth to imagine a totality of which we're a part, and which is a part of us that allows us to realize our own divinity, our own supreme goodness as we stand for truth, justice, and righteousness. So happy to have Mr. Cooke here today to talk about his contributions to recognizing Black women. And also, if you can see the chat, Dr. Robina did leave his organization's contact information.
Okay,
Something
so
I
we're
think
done.
of, or a question that I have, and this is a bit more like rudimentary just in terms of like application. So in our current day social era, there's a lot of things that have become imbalanced because of how we've, contributed to society and stuff. And so I wonder what what does like an authentic divine feminine energy look like for us now? Like how would it be for me to show up in that way, given how society is and given that, yeah, just things have shifted and even to the basic level of like gender roles and not to confine divine feminine energy into that. But I think that's kind of how I think about it. Like if we're talking about present day, how can we help people, or even myself, understand how does that divine feminine energy show up in the most authentic way present day?
I think that's such a good question. And I think when people think of it, they have to think about it in the social context within which we find ourselves. We're not in a culture where everybody thinks in to logic or holistically or in an integrative way. But in this morass that we find ourselves in the United States of America, Letitia James comes to mind. The only one who's chosen to stand up for what is not just and hold everybody to the same standard. The prosecuting attorney in Georgia, I'm blanking on her name, she comes to mind. Anybody who's trying to stand for what's just and right and good and equitable and make it better for the whole can claim at least an aspect of that energy being a part of them, if not driving them. We would be hard pressed to find someone who has manifest the totality of that in every aspect of their lives in this social context. We're creating that, though. We're creating a collectives and communities and organizations that become a place where women can come to fully realize who they are and manifest that. But those are just two examples that come to mind immediately for me.
I think for me,
I wouldn't try to speak authoritatively about it, but I would think that, to think in terms of the divine feminine would be to think of, present without being without limit, not thinking of what would be the limitations on defining, divine feminine, but thinking of it as being without limit.
You mean the definition being without limits?
The definition, yeah, the definition and the embodiment of it, there are no limits on what you can be and what you can become and what you can create.
Or how it can manifest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Thinking of it as, is this a feminine way of being? Is it a limitless way of being?
I think for me, it's been a lot about challenging the way that the world says that I should show up. So like I often find myself, Rabina, I'm a Pisces, so we're very emotional. And I've been trying to learn how to lean more towards my logic than my emotional reaction in the world. And I think a lot of that comes from the way that society says that Black women aren't allowed to be angry or we're not allowed to be a certain way because then we might be seen as the angry Black woman or aggressive or whatever the case may be. So oftentimes when I am angry and I express that, I feel like I'm guilty, like, or I have feelings of shame associated with that. And like, oh, I should be better able to regulate my emotions, especially as a Black woman psychologist and this, that, and the third. And so I'm trying to figure out ways to lean into my divine Black feminine, which encompasses that, like Nana Linda said, the totality of the human experience and the spiritual experiences that we have. So that is to say that I am allowed to be angry, but how can I express this anger in a way that's not as hurtful to other people, but that also honors the way that I'm actually feeling, which in that moment is angry. So I feel like that has been my kind of journey with it, kind of unpacking the ways that people say that I should show up in the world versus how do I show up in the world and honor myself, but also not become like a tyrant. Shout out to Cowboy Carter. That just got released with that song. But yeah, there's a lot. And I do see a question from the audience. I don't know if you want to Sure
Can I
thing.
respond to your point, Rabina, and then we can go to the audience? I
Yeah,
love that.
I had something too before we go to their question.
Okay. Well, why don't we, well, just because mine speaks to this whole issue of anger and emotions and not being emotional in our reaction, but intellectual. Again, a false dichotomy, I think. The reality is we have feelings, and feelings are our drivers, whether or not we're consciously aware of it or not. The deal with anger is it's probably the strongest emotion we have. People kill, just do all kind of horrible things because they're angry. But what we have to also see is what's the counterbalance? Love.
Mhm.
And oftentimes when we peel back our anger, who we're really angry at is ourselves
Mhm.
for our giving someone else power to send us off like that. So we give love to ourselves oftentimes before we think we deserve it. And we channel that energy, which was the anger, to change the circumstance, to change the situation. The reason we want to do that is anger doesn't, when it's projected, hurt anybody but us. Some people, when we get angry at them, say, oh, good, I got you. I got in. And they take pleasure in that. And it's your body that's going to suffer from those cortisones and those other chemical energies that could damage you. So I think we shouldn't be ashamed of being angry. I think what we have to know is that it's a human emotion. It's a powerful emotion. And we just need to learn to use it, as you were suggesting you're working at doing, so that it's for the greater good of ourselves and the whole. Dr. Robina.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Nanda Linda, in response to Dr. Jojo's comment, and I appreciate that affirmation and reminder for us to live balanced and just like live fully in those emotions. And I would say for me, one of the things that I think about that kind of led me to ask that question is that I feel like even though I like know I show up also like emotional, I think in different ways I have like grown up or kind of like been socialized and also just kind of choose to show up in a way that we talk about nurturing with the divine feminine. But for me, it's that it almost seems like when I think of Black divine feminine, like Black women specifically, the way that we show up, our nurturing is it comes up in a lot of different ways. It's not just okay, what you think of like a mother figure, like they do this or they do that, but it's like we uphold the community in so many different ways. And a lot of that does go back to the positions that we were put in with colonization, like on the continent, or enslavement in the Americas. And that had to do with us doing physical labor and, you know, taking care of the kids and just a lot of different things, to where it's like, okay, nurturing at this point seems like it could be anything, not just emotional. And so now I feel like for me, I'm at a stage where I'm trying to figure out how do I kind of bring in that balance of being what they call like, you know, that soft life that people talk about, or just kind of not feeling like I have to be the person who, even in relationships, romantic, platonic, whatever, familial, you know, sibling ones, where I'm the one who has to like take charge and do certain things, because I've also in some ways interpreted that as having like a more nurturing energy. But in some ways, like I would say that maybe people might interpret that as more like masculine energy. So I think it's, yeah, me trying to understand the two, which again goes back to ridding myself of that like dichotomous thinking, because I'm trying to have the both and, but it's also like for this specific topic, it seems like for me, nurturing has just kind of become like, this is what we do as Black women. And we live in the femininity, but we also, again, like we live in that masculine energy. But what is that balance of what's the healthiest for us to live with our role in the movement of Black liberation?
Excellent question. Just real quick, love is the most powerful force in the universe. And when you are in love, within you, and you're expressing it outwardly, oftentimes you have to stand and speak things that people don't want to hear. Point out things that need adjusting, that people aren't interested in investing. And so I think just the realization that as I express my divine Black feminine, it's not always going to appear to people as nurturing. It will only appear to people as nurturing when they realize I'm coming from a place of love. And because I love you, I have to say something. So there's so much we need to go. Let's go to our comment or question from the audience.
Okay, I was actually just responding to them. So Pierre asked the question of, let's see, they said, I have a question. What is our relationship with the most important Black man in the world? So then I responded and asked for more context, and their response was to mention Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, and then they responded, that's the president of the African Development Bank Group. And it was created 5 months later after Malcolm got killed. And they said that we have multiple Black organizations, but no one knows who this is. So my question that I actually was going to respond to them and ask is, what makes them the most important, what they say, the most important Black man in the world is my question. But in the meantime, you all could give your thoughts on that.
And say again what his role is.
He's the 8th elected president of the African Development Bank Group.
Okay. Is he trying to get Africa off the IMF? Because if that's what he's up to and that's what they're up to, I have to applaud him, because Africa will not be free other than the colonial and neo-colonial puppet of a white supremacist monetary system, economic system, until we learn to get off of and away from the International Monetary Fund and create our own food and work within our own communities to trade and do all those things that would sustain us. That's my personal opinion.
I think the viewer said that, yes, the president is trying to do that, Nana Linda,
Great.
as far as separate Africa's financial. He controls all the funds for Africa.
Excellent.
I guess from this viewer's perspective, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Pierre, in the comments, it seems that what makes him the most powerful man is his proximity to capitalism, or his ability to, or capacity to change the financial the financial resources of Africa.
Yeah, I think my curiosity with that is with, unfortunately, a lot of leaders who've come up, it's only been a few years since some African countries have been free from being colonized. And I think one of his previous roles was like I don't know if they say minister or leader of something to do with agriculture within like Nigeria. And in a lot of countries that are former colonies, I'll speak just specifically to like former British colonies, because that's what I know more of, and then some of the French ones, but there's a lot of corruption that goes on even within those ministries, because agriculture and rural development and anything that has to do with like geopolitical stuff within Africa, like those are some of the most exploited ministries within like the government entities. And so a lot of these countries like France and Britain and the Portuguese and all those other places that have been exploiting Africa, like they go to those places because they want the land still, they want the oil, they want the gold, they want like all those things that are putting us in very like compromising, exploitative positions to where Congo is experiencing a genocide right now. Like I think they're very connected to that. So similarly, I'm also like, I question the proximity to capitalism and other, white supremacist type of systems and what that is doing for the, desire to break free from Africa needing to rely on these other world entities.
Well, it might be, he might be the most important African man in the world, but I think we have to be cautious about putting that mantle on any one person, because we have to keep in mind that if we're going to reach our ultimate goal, it's going to take all of us. And any of us here and anyone in our audience could be the most important, element in that. And we just don't know. I mean, we have to all be striving towards, recognizing what it is that we need to be and become, and see the potential in ourselves, because all of us have the capacity, to influence, the direction that our world is going to go in and create the world that's going to get created. And we don't know who's the most important at this point. We may all be very important.
Well, certainly from an optimal African-centered view, we are all important. There is no most important because we're all part of the same energies and come here with purpose and that kind of thing. But I can see the question emerging from someone who kind of sees the world differently than that. Jonathan.
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking about divine feminine versus divine masculine, from a divine place and then from a societal place. As you said, Dr. Myers, we're all in the context. And I think about how that's perceived and how gender and anatomical bodies are treated differently based on how they express that energy.
Mhm.
And so I'm thinking in particular about, growing up as I didn't know it then, but as a same gender loving boy, right? I had a lot of characteristics that my father, from his worldly eyes, right, would consider feminine. And now more, now a person who's much older, I've come to also understand a lot of the masculine, quote unquote, masculine traits that I have. And now I see myself like, wow, that's actually is very much masculine. But for so long, I thought of myself as more on this feminine because that's what my father kept saying, right? He kept saying, don't be that, don't be that, don't be that. And so I think about that in the context of divine versus what we hear in our families based on what societal's definitions are, and how do we help people tease that apart and embrace that divine feminine masculine and not get caught up in sort of the what I would say is this tainted view of the masculine and feminine based on white supremacy and whiteness. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And I think the challenge is recognizing the divinity within us. And when I recognize the divinity within me, I see that divinity manifesting in what might be called feminine and masculine. Probably the most feminine act any woman ever engages in is childbirth. And for any woman who's ever had a child, I don't know if there's much feminine about it unless you're just one of those women blessed to pop the baby out, which is not the case with most women. I mean, that is you have to be some serious, committed, strong, got to get this done. And if people assign that as masculine energy, then so be it. But it is essential to the things we have to do in this body, in this life. So I think if we can marry, I think the reason the divine feminine emerges is because as our ancient Africans ancestors looked at the cosmos, they said, and Jehudi, the sage of the time, said, everything has gender, everything, there's masculine and feminine in everything. That's a duality that is a complement, and you can't have one without the other. We cannot have another human being without a man and a woman. Even though we have technology, we can put the egg and fertilize, do all kinds of things, but the bottom line is both are needed to the greater good of the whole. So I think your point is so important to help people think about how do we dismiss and rid ourselves of these toxic identifications that come to us from the current missocialization. How do we get in touch with our own divinity? Because when I do that, then I can see it in you. And that's what Sawubona is about. I see you. I see the divinity in you. And the problem in this social context is I can't see the divinity in you unless I can first see it in myself. So it's a developmental process. And it's nothing we can jump to this insanity to enlightenment just with a snap. It's developmental, but asking the questions you are asking and making the points we're making, I think, is a step in the right direction.
I just want to touch on that piece around people seeing it in others, because, based on my own experience and based on the research and clinical work I do with a lot of folks who are same-gender loving, it's often their parents recognizing and saying something before they even recognize it, right? And so again, it's like this, I'll keep it on me. My father was seeing something that he identified as feminine in me before I even identified it as feminine. And so then I wonder too, if we all, regardless of gender, have both the divine feminine and divine masculine within us, maybe there was some sort of fear of the divine feminine in himself, and then he tried to kill it off in me, right? And so, and I wonder how many parents are doing that with their children, right? Even with their daughters, right? Like, do they see the divine masculine in them, but trying to kill off the divine masculine in them, et cetera, figuratively speaking. So I wonder how much that is going on. And again, how do we help parents understand that? And I think, it's this re-education or this culturalization, as Dr. Wade Nobles would say, around teasing apart what's our actual heritage and then what is sort of the toxic, sort of maybe nationalist sort of thing that we've sort of got tainted with as well. So that's that you help me think about that, how people see it in others, sometimes before people can see it in themselves, and then because they're afraid of that, they attack.
Absolutely. And
I think about too, like when you say that, how it goes, man, it's like everything kind of just goes back to how we have been tried to be like silenced as African people. Because when you mentioned that, and then Dr. Lassiter, what you added on makes me think about like the book that Dr. Joy DeGray wrote about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And in it, she talks about how there's this fear that we have of our own people seeing us and how we respond, like, what you looking at, like, just very defensively. And it's almost more like when you know that the other person can kind of see a little bit of you, there's a discomfort that we feel because we're not as comfortable with ourselves. But I think about, like, for example, with Black mothers, sometimes I've seen like on social media, folks talking about how there's some Black mothers might impose certain wills or characteristics on their children, specifically their daughters, and how it just creates like this negative relationship with them where it's like, okay, I didn't have a chance to do this. And so there's almost like a jealous spirit that kind of exists. And I think part of that is because our mothers historically have not been able to live in their truth or live in the ways that they want to, or have that freedom of choice, where a lot of times in our community, that masculine energy is like, these are the people that are the authority in the household or who make the decisions, and the voice is stripped from the woman or the daughter. And so that kind of perpetuates where it's like, well, the mother was never able to have that. And so now there's this resentment that has grown, which is to neither of their faults really, but it doesn't create a good system within the family. And so now the communication is broken down. Now I don't want to see you, or I can't even see you because I was never seen. Like, it just gets so deep in it. Like, it just, even me like saying it out loud, I'm like, this just, it hurts to know that this is the type of system that we're in. And also it's why it's important, the work that like each of us are doing and the people in the comments, like asking these questions. And I know that they're doing work too, that it allows us to kind of continue to free ourselves in the process and heal each other in as a community. Like the person, like Pierre said, like it is about unity. Once we kind of get back to our collective, you know, mindset and like those virtues of Ma'at, like the world, our world can slowly get back in order of how it should be, divine order.
You know, when I love me, I'm going to love you in all your manifestations. So when I see my child, when I learn to see the divinity in me and love me, I will see that in my child and love my child. And that will be the thing that will break down the jealousy, the anger, the shame, the guilt, all of that negative energy, those negative feelings that become the drivers that separate us in human relationships. So self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge, and self-knowledge is based on self-gnosis, gnosis being the realization of our connection to that divine creative life force. But we have wonderful questions, so let's jump to those.
Yeah, I agree. We have a lot of questions today, but obviously because we're having a great discussion. One of the questions that followed, let's see if I can find it. Which you guys were kind of getting into already, is how do you respond to divinity being present in the world only in the way we connect with it and express its will? So I'll read that again just because the way it's posed is a little confusing. But how do you respond to divinity being present in the world only in the way we connect with it and express its will? Any thoughts on that question?
I'm not sure how to answer that question because I'm not sure that divinity is expressed only in the way that we recognize it. I think that part of our problem with divinity is that we don't understand it well enough to recognize it. We don't see the divinity that's there because we have this expectation that the divinity is supposed to look like something else that we're not seeing. And so I'm not sure I agree with the question.
Well, it's a great question. I think the way it's framed, though, lets us know that it's emerging from the assumption that divine energy, spirit being, supreme being, higher power, whatever that creative life force energy, source energy is something that requires our connecting with it. It is, whether we connect with it or not. But the intention is that we gain enough self-knowledge of who we are, what we are, how things work, how things are really constructed in this cosmos, that we realize, not only am I connected, I am inseparable. And basically, my biggest challenge is to be still, as some people would say, be silent, listen, and know it exists, whether we know it or not, or acknowledge it or not, and connect with it or not. And it's not our fault because we're told just the opposite is true. Oh no, you need an intermediary. You can't even communicate with this creative life force unless you go to the minister, the Pope, to somebody. No, that's a totally patriarchal Euro-Western idea. And women don't even try to get in the pulpit because, stop. Just get back to the reality of the divine Black feminine, that creative life energy. And so it really is going to require us shifting our consciousness.
We think what we've been taught to think. And if we want to get beyond that, as Nana Linda says, it does start with self-knowledge. It starts with examining the self and accepting parts of yourself that you have denied before, and seeing those pieces of yourself in you so that you can see those pieces of yourself in others and see pieces of others in yourself.
Yeah, I really like what Nana Linda was saying as far as it either is or it isn't, whether we're conscious of that divine or that divinity within us. And it really speaks to this. I mean, a lot of us are still processing, but this wonderful trip that Dr. Onwanga organized for a lot of us who identify as Black mental health professionals. And it just felt like a very, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, like in a concrete way, but also in a philosophical and spiritual way, a homecoming, even though that's like a buzzword, but it felt like those of us who were born on the continent traveling to Africa and being in Africa for quite some time and being exposed to certain indigenous practices or different ways of life that we're not used to in the West. That was a very much so an awakening for a lot of us. Like I felt like spiritually, I was able to be like, yeah, I don't have to do a lot to be connected to the divine feminine. Like, of course, meditating and doing yoga and, you know, connecting with priestess or whomever your religious leaders are, that might get you closer, or it might make you more conscious of the divinity within you. But like, that's not the only way. So I really appreciated that conversation.
It's not connecting, it's recognizing that you are connected.
Selma said contemplation is the highest form of ritual.
I can't remember who mentioned it. It was like one of our conversations that we've had. We've been going, what, almost 3-4 years strong now, but the phrasing remembering, and somebody had put it like you're like the word member, it's like
Putting the members back together.
yeah, you're joining back into like the membership. So like when I think about going like home, or even when we're able to do it in the ways that we can here, like in the diaspora, like through ABPsi or different communities that we have, like the lab that you have, Spirit Lab, Dr. Lassiter, like those are ways that we can come back into our membership, our kinship, and that does a lot for us. Like our recollection, like we're able to collect ourselves and come back to who we are when we're in those spaces. And those are the spaces then we can now really see each other for who we are and increase that self-knowledge, which is like the consciousness is such a big part of our liberation, which is why we come here on Mondays and have these conversations and try to engage.
We have these conversations.
Yeah.
And also really quickly, I know we're about to wrap up, but it brings to mind that Dr. Bethea, she loves to use this term like remember, emphasis on like the being separate from the member, because it is about, like Dr. Onwanga said, our coming to that consciousness. And lastly, really quickly, before we will be remiss not to recognize that today is our national president's birthday. Dr. Sherman Bethea is an Aries, which is why, you know, she's so fiery and feisty sometimes, but we love her and we certainly need that energy. So I just wanted to really quickly.
She's in Ghana right now, soaking it up.
Yeah, happy solar return.
Happy birthday, Dr. Bethea.
Absolutely. And I think that we've had so many good questions from our audience. And one I'm noticing had to do with why we're not policing corruption in our Black organizations. We have to. That's part of the return of the divine Black feminine. That's part of the remembering of who we are culturally and our values and our grounding. So, you know, we're out of time. So good that you joined us. Looks like this has been a great conversation. Thanks again to Gregory Cooke for joining us earlier. And we set off a very intense conversation today. Peace and blessings. Until the next time.
Ashe.